Thank you, Mr Chair. Mr Chair, I stand to take a call on Part 3 of the Environment Canterbury Bill. We're dealing with this bill under urgency, no select committee process, as we strip away the right of Cantabrians to have the vote. Part 3, the particular part I want to deal with in Part 3 is Subpart 3, which deals with water conservation orders. Water conservation orders are a tremendously important part of the environmental regulation of New Zealand. Most people probably are completely unaware of water conservation orders, to be fair, which is why the government's quietly moving on them in this bill. And water conservation orders are national parks for our rivers. They set standards. For example, the water conservation order on the Ahuriri sets a minimum flow rate. 10 cubic metres per second of water has to flow through the Ahuriri, and if it falls below that, then water takes have to drop out. So they're a way for us to protect our rivers, and they have a whole bunch of conditions on them. Now, what this bill does is basically fundamentally change water conservation orders for Canterbury, both the process for dealing with water conservation orders, in particularly the Huranui one, and also what could happen to the existing water conservation orders. So the first thing is the Huranui one. Now, it's not correct to say that there is a water conservation order currently on the Huranui River. In fact, there's a process underway. It was due to go to the Environment Court in May or June, which has been an issue of contention. And what this bill does is cut that process off at the knees. So instead of, after the applicants have spent many hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to get this process through, going through a special tribunal, the Environment Court and then to the Minister, what this bill does is intervene in the middle of that process and send it off to the government's hand-picked commissioners to make the decision about whether the Huranui water conservation order will be decided or not. And then it goes off to the Minister for the Environment. So what this does is cuts through the existing process. Now, from my point of view and from those who care about rivers, this is a totally unacceptable cutting off of the normal process for water conservation orders. Now, that would be worrying enough in a bill that ostensibly is supposed to be about Environment Canterbury, but actually at the back of this bill is actually the process of cutting off the application for the Huranui Water Conservation Order. That is the attempt to put a national park on the Huranui River. The Huranui, for those who don't know, is the last remaining wild river that runs from the mountains to the sea via a natural lake on the east coast of the South Island. And it is subject to, there's an irrigation scheme. They want to put a 70-metre dam on the south bank. They want to put a weir on the south branch, rather. They want to put a weir on the north branch. What this bill does is intervene in that process of trying to protect the Huranui through a water conservation order, and the danger is that we will open it up to the irrigation project which has been so talked about. But if it was just about the Huranui, it would be worrying enough. But the other problem is that this bill makes it now possible for any irrigator in the country to apply to the Minister for the Environment to open up any of the existing water conservation orders without going through the normal process. Normally, if you want to amend or revoke a water conservation order, there is a very elaborate process you have to go through because they are like national parks. So what this bill does is suddenly open up the existing Canterbury water conservation orders so that they can be contested by the irrigators. Graham Sutton from Irrigation New Zealand is jubilant about this bill because he knows what it means for the existing water conservation orders. For example, on the Ahuriri, people may remember the cubicle farm application. The cubicle farm application on Killamont Station relied on taking water out of the Ahuriri River in order to irrigate the Killamont Station. Now, there's no way they could have gone ahead with that project under the current law. But what this bill does now is allow those who are putting forward the cubicle farm application to go to the Minister for the Environment without any of the normal due process to get a variation on the water conservation order on the Ahuriri River so that they can get access to water to irrigate Killamont Station, even though it would take it below the current minimum flow outlined in that water conservation order. That is what this bill is setting up. That is that you can revoke and amend the existing water conservation orders, Ahuriri, Rakaya, Rangitada, Ellesmere Te Waihora. All of them can be amended through basically a stroke of the pen of the Minister for the Environment. So there we thought we had national parks for our rivers. The environment movement has fought battle after battle, has spent literally millions of dollars to get water conservation orders in place across New Zealand, including in Canterbury. And now, because of the votes of National Act and the Māori Party, we are going to see water conservation orders that can be upended at the whim of the Minister for the Environment at the stroke of a pen. Water conservation orders protecting some of our most important rivers in Canterbury can now be overturned. Now, Mr Chair.
I call Dr Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Chair. So, on the one hand, we have the special situation under the schedule, tucked away in the schedules that relate to this part, which deals with the Huranui, to give special consideration to the Huranui so that the irrigation scheme can go ahead and Mr Carter can get access to water for his farm. Aside from the Huranui situation, we have a more general problem with all of the water conservation orders in Canterbury are now under the gun. Something the environment movement fought for long and hard, something that we have worked with tangata whenua for over many years in order to get in place water conservation orders to protect our wonderful rivers. I was on the Huranui on Sunday. I met with Mark Solomon from Ngaitahu. We spoke at great length about what a precious river that was and how important it was that there's a water conservation order to protect that river from the irrigators. And yet here we have the Māori Party today voting for a bill that threatens the Huranui River. It seems to me totally unacceptable that anybody who cares about the wild rivers of this country could vote for a bill which threatens the water conservation order on the Huranui and also opens up every existing water conservation order in the Canterbury region can now be overturned at the stroke of a pen by the Minister. Now, what kind of a national park do we have then? We have a national park that's a bit like, well, maybe it's a national park like, the Schedule 4 national parks that can be mined. Those kind of national parks, the national parks that we thought were for good, but in fact these water conservation orders, the water in them can now be mined for irrigation schemes because of the changes that the government is forcing through all through the day and all through the night without a select committee process under urgency. I just wanted to respond to some of the Minister's comments and attacks on myself and the Green Party. The Minister has made various comments which personally I take offence at, where he says that we are doing an ad hominem attack, is the allegation, against Mr Creech, essentially. I would dispute that. I would say that the issue with Mr Creech is not Mr Creech himself. The issue is that he was the director of a dairy company who was doing a review of the regulator of the dairy industry in Canterbury. That was the issue with the appointment of Mr Creech. It wasn't that Mr Creech was a bad person. It was that Mr Creech was, at that time, a director of a dairy company which had multiple convictions for pollution of water and at that stage was doing a review of the regulator of the dairy industry. That is not an ad hominem attack. That is a problem with actually setting up a structure whereby you appoint someone who should never have had that role. And it is that review which has provided the basis for this bill. And the extraordinary thing about the water conservation order part of this bill, of course, this subpart 3, is that there's no way you can take the changes to water conservation order out of the fact that the ECAN may have been too slow on its resource consents, that ECAN may not have processed enough resource consents to suit some irrigators. You can't blame water conservation orders for that. It's not the fault of water conservation orders which have been fought for in good faith by the environment movement and tangata whenua over many years. You cannot blame water conservation orders for that, and yet here we have in subpart 3 of part 3 of this bill and tucked away, hidden away in Schedule 2, a whole series of changes to the way that water conservation orders currently work. These are the orders that protect our nationally significant rivers. It's also important to look at the way the test is going to be changed. And there's quite a lot of lack of clarity as to the test of what is now going to be a water conservation order in the Canterbury region. This bill introduces a whole series of conflicting things that must be taken into account in any consideration of a water conservation order in the Canterbury region. It is unclear where all of this will end up. It's almost certainly the case that it no longer prioritises water bodies of national significance, which was always meant to be the whole purpose of a water conservation order. It was to protect water bodies of national significance in perpetuity. The whole idea of it is that it was like a national park for rivers, and that is